I was treated like a gold digger at dinner with my boyfriend's mother. When she learned who I was, her smile froze. My name is Ava Hart. I'm 31 and I'm a litigation attorney in San Francisco. Every morning, I take the BART from my tiny studio in Soma, wearing plain slacks, a worn blazer, and the same black flats I've owned for years. No one on that train would ever guess that I once saved a multi-million-dollar company from collapse, least of all my boyfriend. I keep it that way by choice. I want to be seen for my character, not my title. Daniel Bennett, 33, is a product engineer with the kind of gentle optimism that makes people trust him instantly. He grew up in Atherton, where glass-walled mansions hide behind trimmed hedges and family names open more doors than resumes. His mother, Victoria Bennett, runs a successful image consulting firm and believes appearances tell you everything worth knowing about a person. To her, I'm the girl her son is helping, not loving a possible gold digger who dresses like a public defender. When she invited me to dinner at their estate, she said it was a chance to get to know each other properly. I accepted, not out of politeness, but curiosity, a quiet experiment to see how people act when they think they already know your worth. Have you ever hidden a part of yourself just to see how someone would treat you if they didn't know what you had? I grew up far from the glass towers of San Francisco, in a place where winter lasted half the year and the sound of machines was as familiar as birdsong. Spokane, Washington, my hometown, wasn't glamorous, but it had a rhythm all its own. The hiss of welding torches from my father's garage, the rustle of pages turning in the small public library where my mother worked. Our house smelled of oil and old paper, a strange but comforting mix that still follows me in memory. My father fixed everything from tractors to snowblowers, his hands always rough and stained with grease, while my mother spent her days cataloging books and reading poetry aloud to children. We didn't have much, but we had honesty, and that was worth more than anything money could buy. When I was little, my mother would come home with chalk dust still on her sleeves and say, "Respect isn't something you purchase, Ava. You earn it by being kind and by doing your work well." My father would nod, wiping his hands with an old rag, and add, "And if you can't buy something, fix it." That goes for things and people alike. Those were the first laws I ever learned, long before law school taught me about statutes or contracts. I watched how they treated everyone who crossed their path, the cashier, the janitor, the mayor, with the same quiet dignity. And maybe that's why I've never been impressed by wealth. I've seen too many people measure worth by numbers when the only currency that really matters is decency. But even in Spokane, where people prided themselves on being down to earth, judgment had a way of slipping through the cracks. In middle school, I was the kid with the second-hand backpack and the same shoes for 3 years. Some of the girls laughed at the grease stains on my father's coveralls when he picked me up from school. One of them once whispered, "Her dad's a mechanic. No wonder she never joins the ski trips." I didn't say anything. I just stared at the snow outside the classroom window and promised myself that one day I'd stand in rooms where people like that would have to listen to me. But I also promised something else, that I'd never forget how it felt to be looked down on for things that had nothing to do with my worth. My mother's favorite book was a worn collection of essays by Emerson. On my 15th birthday, she gave me an old fountain pen she'd found in a second-hand shop. On the brass barrel, she'd engraved 4 words. "Do right, fear nothing." She said, "This will be your compass, no matter how far you go." I didn't realize then how much that phrase would define my life. When I first decided to study law, people in our neighborhood thought it was a joke. "Lawyers come from money, Ava," one of my teachers said. "You'll need connections." I smiled politely, but inside I burned. Maybe that was my first real lesson about contracts, how people sign invisible ones every day, agreeing to believe that only certain kinds of people are meant to win. I swore I'd write my own terms. In high school, I joined debate club, the only student who didn't wear tailored blazers or own cue cards printed at Kinko's. I scribbled my notes on library receipts, standing in front of a crowd of smirking competitors. My voice shook the first few rounds, But something happened the moment I realized logic could dismantle arrogance. I started winning. Each victory felt like hammering a nail into the idea that appearance equaled competence. I won regionals, then state, and a scholarship to UCLA. When the letter arrived, my father stuck it on the fridge next to his old wrench, grinning so wide it erased years of exhaustion. "See?" he said. "Brains and grit fix anything." UCLA law was both everything I dreamed of and everything I feared. The campus gleamed with ambition students in tailored suits, professors who had clerked for Supreme Court justices, conversations sprinkled with words like mergers, arbitration, and corporate ladder. I arrived with a second-hand laptop, a single black suit from Goodwill, and a head full of determination. My scholarship covered tuition, but not dignity. So I built that from scratch. I spent mornings in the library, nights filing paperwork at the legal clinic, and weekends volunteering at the pro bono center downtown, helping tenants fight unfair evictions. I wasn't the loudest in class or the most connected, but I learned to outwork everyone. When others chased prestige, I chased precision. Every clause mattered, every comma carried consequences. During my second year, I joined a litigation clinic that specialized in commercial and real estate disputes. It was brutal long hours, impossible clients, and professors who believed law was less a subject and more a war zone. One afternoon, a small business owner came to us in tears. A contract loophole was about to let her landlord double her rent overnight. She was going to lose her shop. Everyone else saw a lost cause. I saw an opening. I spent 3 nights combing through the lease until I found a single ambiguous phrase in the termination clause. We filed for an emergency injunction, and the judge granted it. That moment, the woman's stunned gratitude, the judge's measured nod burned itself into me. That's when I knew I wanted to work in litigation. The adrenaline, the clarity, the justice of it was a battlefield I understood. After graduation, I joined a small boutique firm in downtown San Francisco, Hart & Cole. No glossy skyscraper lobby, no mahogany conference tables. Just 5 lawyers, a coffee machine that leaked, and a view of a brick wall. But it was real. The partners were scrappy and sharp, the kind who could outthink bigger firms with half the resources. They gave me cases others wouldn't touch. Emergency injunctions, TRO's temporary restraining orders that could make or break a company overnight. While most associates dreaded those 3 a.m. filings, I thrived on them. I liked the pressure, the way words could move judges faster than money ever could. My name started circulating quietly in the Bay Area legal circuit. "The girl who writes TROs like poetry," one partner joked. But even as my reputation grew, I kept my life small. I rented a studio above a bakery in Soma, where the smell of bread woke me every morning. My apartment was barely big enough for a bed, a bookshelf, and a folding desk. I didn't care. It was mine, and it was quiet. I could hear the city hum below me, the clatter of skateboards, the hiss of espresso machines, the distant horns from the Embarcadero. While my colleagues moved into penthouses and bought Teslas, I walked to work, ate ramen from the corner shop, and saved my money for nothing in particular. Freedom, I'd learned, was cheaper when you stopped buying things to impress people who didn't notice you anyway. At Hart & Cole, success didn't mean marble floors or long titles. It meant surviving. It meant fighting for clients who were always one court order away from ruin. I learned to navigate judges' tempers, opposing counsel's egos, and my own exhaustion. Some nights, I'd fall asleep at my desk with case files open, the city lights spilling through the window like thin ribbons of gold. And yet, I never felt lonely. I liked being the quiet force behind other people's victories. A few years in, I was promoted to counsel, unusual for someone my age. By then, I had handled enough injunctions and emergency motions to earn the trust of even the most skeptical partners. My first solo case as lead counsel involved a logistics company facing a predatory takeover. We had 48 hours to stop a hostile acquisition. The opposing firm had 30 attorneys. I had a laptop, 2 paralegals, and a gallon of coffee. I didn't sleep for 2 days, but when the judge signed our motion, I felt a stillness inside me that I can't describe, a quiet proof that I belonged in this city of sharks. Of course, success had its price. My social life dwindled to phone calls with my parents and Friday dinners alone at the ramen place downstairs. But I didn't mind. I wasn't lonely, just focused. When you come from a world where everything you own can fit into a single suitcase, ambition feels less like greed and more like survival. My colleagues teased me for living like a student, but to me, simplicity wasn't deprivation. It was power. Power to say no. To choose my cases, my hours, my peace. Sometimes, late at night, I'd look out the window of the firm's tiny office and see the skyscrapers glowing against the fog. And I'd think about that promise I made years ago to never let anyone measure my worth by what I wore. I had kept it. My suits were still plain, my shoes practical, my makeup minimal. Yet I'd become the kind of lawyer who could make billion-dollar corporations pause mid-sentence. That irony always made me smile. When clients thanked me, I'd nod politely but say little. Gratitude was nice, but what I wanted most was to stay invisible, to let the work speak louder than I ever could. Maybe that's why I kept my personal life separate from my professional one. The courtroom was where I spoke with authority. Everywhere else, I preferred silence. I met Daniel on a gray Saturday morning at the Mill, the cafe on Divisadero that smelled perpetually of fresh bread and roasted coffee. I'd gone there to read a brief for an upcoming hearing, hoping a change of scenery might make the dense language less suffocating. My table was cluttered with papers, highlighters, and my mother's brass pen when someone gently tapped the corner of the stack. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft, careful. "You look like you're either writing a novel or suing someone. Which is it?" I looked up to find a man in a navy sweater, eyes warm but tired in the way that people who think too much often look. "Depends on how this latte turns out," I replied. He smiled, the kind that starts slow and stays. He asked if he could share my table, no seats left, and before I knew it, we were talking about books. Not the small talk kind, but real talk. Baldwin, Orwell, and whether technology makes us more connected or more alone. He told me he was a product engineer at a startup that built AI tools for accessibility, software that helped people with disabilities navigate digital spaces. His words carried conviction, not ego. I remember thinking, he builds things that make life easier, while I spent my days tearing down contracts that made life harder. Maybe that's why the conversation felt like breathing. We started meeting at the Mill every weekend, sometimes by accident, sometimes by plan. Daniel was the kind of man who noticed the small things. When I skipped lunch, when I reread the same paragraph, when I smiled without realizing it. He never asked about my job beyond, "Rough week?" And somehow, that restraint made me trust him more. One morning, after our third or fourth meeting, he asked, "You always look so focused. What do you do?" I hesitated. The truth that I was a litigation counsel at a firm known for corporate rescue cases often changed the way people treated me. They heard lawyer and imagined arrogance, confrontation, wealth. I wanted him to see me, not the armor I wore in court. So I said simply, "Commercial law. Mostly business disputes." He nodded, not pressing. "Sounds intense." I smiled. "Sometimes, but I like it." The weeks turned into months. We hiked along the Marin headlands, took ferry rides to Sausalito, and spent lazy evenings cooking pasta in his apartment overlooking the bay. He made space feel safe, unhurried, gentle. But even in his calm, I sensed a shadow. Every time his phone buzzed with a text labeled Mom, his body stiffened. Sometimes he'd joke about it, saying, "She means well, she just has high standards." Other times, his silence spoke louder. I learned that Victoria Bennett wasn't just a mother but an institution in the Bay Area, a high-profile image consultant who advised CEOs and politicians on how to present themselves with grace. His father, Charles, was an investor known for hosting wine galas in Napa. Perfection wasn't just encouraged in their family, it was demanded. Daniel, for all his kindness, lived under an invisible contract. "Don't embarrass us." He told me once, on a foggy walk near Ocean Beach, that he dated women who fit the family mold: flawless, well-connected, elegant, but none of it ever felt real. "They all spoke like press releases," he said, kicking at the sand. "My mom adored them, though. I guess she wants someone who photographs well at dinner parties." I laughed, half joking. "Well, that's one thing I'll fail at. I blink in every photo." He smiled, but there was a quiet in his eyes, like he was already imagining the conflict to come. We didn't talk much about money or status. Our relationship was built on smaller things: the comfort of silence, the shared love of jazz, the way he'd hum under his breath while fixing his bike. When we did talk about our jobs, he'd tell stories about product deadlines or design challenges, while I stayed vague. "How's work?" he'd ask, and I'd answer, "Busy, but manageable." I never mentioned the kind of clients I had or the stakes of their cases. Not out of deceit, but because so much of my work lived behind confidentiality agreements. And, perhaps deeper down, I feared what he'd think if he knew I was often negotiating contracts for people who moved in the same circles as his parents', people who could buy and sell reputations like stocks. Once, over dinner, he told me about a rough patch his parents' family business had gone through years ago. "There was this massive legal mess," he said, stirring his pasta. "Mom thought we'd lose the vineyard. Then, out of nowhere, some attorney saved everything with a last-minute injunction. Dad still calls her the ghost lawyer. He never met her in person, but apparently she worked miracles." I froze for half a second. I knew exactly which case he was talking about. I'd been that lawyer. Back then, the file came to me under a confidentiality clause. I'd worked through the night drafting the injunction that stopped a predatory merger from consuming their winery. I remembered the case number, the dates, even the stress fracture on my wrist from overtyping. But I only smiled faintly and said, "Sounds like she was good at her job." He nodded. "Yeah, lucky break for my parents." That night, lying awake beside him, I thought about irony, the way life folds in on itself when you least expect it. I could have told him the truth right then. But something held me back, a quiet voice saying, "If he loves you for who you are, not what you've done, you'll never have to prove anything." So I stayed silent. Our relationship settled into a rhythm that felt natural. He'd bring me coffee before my early hearings, and I'd proofread his design proposals while he cooked dinner. It was easy, and for a long time, I let myself believe that kindness could insulate us from class, history, and expectation. But deep down, I knew that truth always finds its way out, and when it does, it tests the foundations we think are strongest. Before I ever met Daniel, before I knew what his mother's voice sounded like over the phone, the Bennett name had already crossed my desk, printed neatly at the top of a file marked confidential, urgent. The case had come to me through an old friend from UCLA Law, Ethan Clark, who now worked at a mid-sized firm handling corporate restructuring. It was one of those last-minute referrals that land in your inbox at 11:43 p.m. on a Wednesday. Need help with a TRO by Friday. Family business. Major investors circling. Attached was a summary that read like the beginning of a financial obituary. Bennett Ridge Winery, Napa Valley, CA. I remember leaning back in my chair, reading through the pages while the city slept outside my window. The Bennetts, it seemed, were a legacy family, 3 generations of wine growers, a respected name in the valley. But years of overleveraging and a bad distribution contract had left them exposed. A creditor had triggered a clause demanding immediate repayment, effectively calling in a multi-million-dollar loan. At the same time, a rival distributor had launched what looked like a hostile acquisition disguised as a rescue offer. And, as if that weren't enough, there was a legal dispute over irrigation rights, with the neighboring vineyard cutting off their main water source right before the harvest. It was a perfect storm of corporate sabotage and bad luck. Ethan's message was short: We need someone who can think fast and stay invisible. You in? Normally, I avoided cases tangled with high society drama. They came with too much ego, too little gratitude. But something about this one pulled me in the sheer unfairness of it. Reading between the lines, I saw a family being strangled by paperwork written years earlier by a lazy advisor. One clause in their distribution contract, the kind no one reads until it's too late, gave the distributor the right to terminate at will if the company showed signs of financial instability. That single phrase could ruin them. And I could fix it. The next morning, I agreed, on one condition: my involvement would remain confidential. Ethan understood. "We'll list you as external counsel under your mother's surname," he said. "We'll handle the client communication. You just work your magic." So in every file, every motion, every internal memo, I wasn't Ava Hart. I was A. Cole, named after my mother's maiden name. It wasn't unusual for attorneys to ghostwrite briefs or act as shadow consultants, but I'd never taken a case where the clients had no idea who I was or how close our worlds actually were. For 72 hours, I lived on caffeine and adrenaline. The vineyard's creditors had scheduled a foreclosure motion for Monday. If we couldn't get a temporary restraining order by then, the bank would seize their assets, the distributor would terminate, and the harvest would rot on the vines. I combed through hundreds of pages of contracts, financial statements, and water rights filings. Somewhere in that mountain of text had to be the loophole I needed. I found it at dawn on Saturday, a single oversight in the distributor's own clause. The contract's termination notice required proof of material instability, yet their notice letter contained only projections, not actual evidence. It was a technicality, but a powerful one. If we could argue that their letter violated due process under the contract, we could freeze the termination until after harvest. I wrote the motion myself, 12 pages of legal reasoning held together by coffee stains and desperation. At 6:12 a.m., I hit send. Ethan called me 2 hours later, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "If this works, they're going to owe you their vineyard." We filed the TRO in Napa County's Superior Court that afternoon. The hearing was brief, the judge stern but fair. When he signed the order, I felt the rush I always did when words became salvation. The Bennett Ridge Winery could continue operating temporarily. But that wasn't enough. A TRO was a band-aid. What they needed was leverage. So over the next 2 weeks, I negotiated directly with the distributor's counsel, seasoned sharks who tried every intimidation tactic in the book. They mocked the small firm letterhead, assumed I was junior, called me Miss Cole with condescending emphasis. I let them. I'd learned long ago that being underestimated was an advantage. When they sent over a revised proposal still packed with predatory terms, I redlined it until the page bled. By the end, we'd stripped the exclusivity clause, extended the payment window, and secured a settlement that not only kept the winery afloat but freed them from the stranglehold of that contract entirely. When the deal was signed, Ethan forwarded me the message from the clients. "Please thank your colleague, whoever she is, she saved us." I read it twice, then closed the email. I didn't need thanks. I'd done my job, and by Monday, I'd already moved on to another emergency case, a property injunction in Oakland. But that name Bennett Ridge stayed with me. Maybe because it had felt personal somehow. A family on the brink, clawing their way back through someone else's fine print. I understood that story too well. Months later, when Daniel and I started dating, he mentioned his parents owned a vineyard in Napa. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. "What's it called?" I asked casually. "Bennett Ridge," he said. "You've probably never heard of it. It's small but kind of old family tradition." I nodded, hiding the flicker of recognition that shot through me. "Sounds lovely," I said. That night, I dug through my case archive, scrolling until I found it. Bennett Ridge Winery versus Northern Valley Distributors. The digital file glowed faintly on my screen, the judge's stamp still visible on the PDF. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered every paragraph, every sleepless night, every cup of cold coffee, and then I laughed quietly at the absurdity of it all. The man I was falling for, the man who made me feel more at peace than I had in years, was the son of the people I'd anonymously saved. I closed the file and promised myself I'd never tell him. It wasn't about secrecy or pride, it was about boundaries. That case had been part of my professional world, and Daniel belonged to the personal one. Mixing the two never ended well. Besides, the NDA I'd signed forbade disclosure of client details, and technically, even naming the case outside professional circles could be a violation. Still, sometimes when he talked about his parents' business, I'd hear echoes of the past: the ghost lawyer who had rescued them, the gratitude they'd expressed to Ethan's firm. Daniel would joke that his mom probably still thought it was divine intervention. Maybe it was, I'd say lightly, sipping my coffee to hide my smile. And yet, a strange unease followed me. Because deep down, I knew secrets have gravity. They pull at the truth until it surfaces. One day, somehow, the lines between the lawyer who saved them and the woman they dismissed as ordinary would blur. And when that happened, it wouldn't just test my relationship, it would expose the silent hypocrisy I'd seen my whole life. How easily people confuse wealth with worth. The call came on a Thursday evening, right after I'd finished drafting a motion for another case. I was sitting by the window, the city lights flickering like distant embers, when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number from the 650 area code. I hesitated before answering, already sensing who it might be. "Hello, this is Ava," I said. A pause, polished, deliberate. Then a woman's voice, sweet but laced with something metallic. "Ava, darling. This is Victoria Bennett, Daniel's mother." Her tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to, her words slow, measured, rehearsed. "I thought it was time we finally spoke," she continued. "Daniel tells me you've been seeing each other for, what, nearly a year now?" I smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. "That's right," I said evenly. "Almost a year." "Well," she went on, "we were thinking it might be nice to have you join us for dinner this weekend. Just family, of course. We always host small gatherings in Atherton this time of year. It's informal, but we do like to look presentable." There was a pause, a deliberate one, before she asked, with syrupy curiosity, "Tell me, dear, what is it that you do again?" Daniel said something about law, but I wasn't sure of the specifics. "I'm a commercial litigation attorney," I replied simply. "Oh, litigation," she said brightly, as though the word itself were a foreign spice she wasn't sure she liked. "That must be stressful. I imagine the pay isn't terribly stable either, depending on the firm, of course. Are you with one of the larger ones?" I could hear the faint hum of crystal glasses clinking in the background, laughter from what must have been another dinner, her world of marble tables and curated charm. "No," I said. "I work for a boutique firm. We focus on emergency injunctions and contract disputes." "I see," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "So, a smaller practice. That's admirable. I always say, it's not about money but about passion, don't you think?" The irony in her voice was almost poetic. Before I could respond, she added, "Well, bring your appetite on Saturday. We'll start at 7. Do you have the address?" "Yes, I think Daniel mentioned it once." "Lovely," she said. "Oh, and one last thing, our dinners tend to be quite elegant. No need to overdress, of course. Just something appropriate." Ender flash. I hung up and sat there for a long moment, staring at my reflection in the dark window. Appropriate. It was such a simple word, but it carried 1,000 unspoken judgments. I texted Daniel, "Your mom called. Dinner at 7. He responded almost instantly. "She did? Wow. That's progress, I guess." "She's trying, I promise." I typed back. "It's fine. I'm curious to meet her properly." But what I didn't type was what I really felt. This wasn't curiosity. It was an experiment. A quiet test in human behavior. The next 2 days passed in slow motion. At the office, I reviewed case files, but my mind drifted constantly to the upcoming dinner. I wasn't nervous. Not exactly, just alert. It felt like preparing for a trial, except this time the verdict wouldn't be written in legal terms, it would be whispered through polite smiles and lingering glances. Saturday evening arrived with its usual San Francisco chill. I stood in front of my closet, scanning rows of tailored suits, pressed blouses, and the one sleek black dress I wore to court dinners. Then, deliberately, I pushed them aside. If Victoria Bennett expected a performance, she would get one, but not the one she wanted. I chose a simple linen dress, soft beige with a faint wrinkle at the hem. Comfortable, unpretentious. On my feet, a pair of worn ballet flats I'd owned since law school. I pulled my hair into a loose bun, applied the lightest touch of mascara, and slipped on my mother's old watch, the brass one with a tiny scratch near the face. On my kitchen counter sat a small brown paper bag from the bakery downstairs. Inside were 6 croissants, still warm, their edges golden and imperfect. I tied the bag with a plain string and tucked a handwritten note under the fold. "Thank you for inviting me. No ribbon, no brand. Just truth." As I slung my satchel over my shoulder, my phone buzzed a court notification. I glanced at the screen and froze. Order granted. Preliminary injunction 24395B. My heart gave a small, strange twist. I didn't need to open the app to know what it was. That was the case number for Bennett Ridge Winery, the same one I'd handled months earlier under my mother's surname. The system didn't show client names, only numbers. But the coincidence, the timing was uncanny. I stared at it for a long second before locking the screen and whispering under my breath, "Not tonight." The drive to Atherton felt like crossing worlds. The city's grit faded into clean streets lined with oaks and white picket fences. Houses here didn't sit on lots, they sat on estates. By the time I reached the Bennett's property, the sun had set and soft amber lights glowed along the driveway. Their home stood at the end, a sprawling colonial revival with ivy creeping up its pillars. It looked more like a magazine spread than a house, polished, symmetrical, and entirely without warmth. I parked near the gate, took a deep breath, and looked down at the paper bag in my hands. My reflection in the car window was calm, unreadable. I'd been in hundreds of boardrooms, faced judges who questioned every word I said, but this was a different kind of trial. One where evidence didn't matter, only perception. As I walked toward the door, I rehearsed nothing. I didn't need to. The rules were simple: observe, stay polite, let them reveal themselves. The house smelled faintly of pine and money. From inside, I could hear laughter, the orchestrated kind, smooth and hollow. I pressed the doorbell, and somewhere deep inside, a chime echoed like the start of cross-examination. When Victoria opened the door, she looked exactly as I'd imagined. Elegant, ageless, her smile precise as a scalpel. "Ava," she said, extending her hand. "So lovely to finally meet you." Her eyes flicked over my dress, my shoes, and then the brown paper bag. The smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind it. "Oh," she said lightly, "you brought something." "Just croissants," I said. "From a bakery near my place. I thought you might like them for breakfast tomorrow." "How thoughtful," she replied, the word landing like glass. As she led me inside, my phone buzzed once more in my purse. I glanced down just long enough to see the screen flash again. "Order granted, preliminary injunction, Bennett Ridge Winery." I silenced it quickly, slipping the phone away before she could notice. But it didn't matter. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. And as I stepped into the glittering dining room, greeted by polite smiles and polite laughter, I thought of the paper bag in my hands, the modest dress, the watch that once belonged to a librarian in Spokane. I didn't bring them as armor, I brought them as truth. And tonight, truth would be my quiet rebellion. The Bennett estate looked like it had been built to impress God himself. A white colonial mansion stood at the end of a sweeping circular drive, its windows glowing with soft, deliberate light. A grand fountain in the center murmured quietly, as if aware that even its sound had to behave. The air smelled of jasmine and money, clean, cultivated, and faintly sweet. As I stepped through the wrought iron gates, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the polished glass doors, the linen dress, the brown paper bag, the calm face that betrayed nothing. I smiled faintly. If this was a performance, then I had decided to play it my way. Victoria opened the door before I could knock twice. She looked like someone who had never been surprised in her life, everything about her controlled, from the smooth blonde bob that framed her face to the tailored silk blouse that whispered rather than rustled when she moved. "Ava," she greeted, her voice light and polished like crystal. "You found us easily?" "Yes, thank you," I said. The directions were very clear. Her eyes swept over me, not with curiosity, but with assessment like a jeweler appraising a stone. They paused briefly on the paper bag in my hands, then on the modest leather strap of my watch, before lifting back to meet my gaze. "You're very punctual," she said with a faint smile. "That's refreshing." Inside, the house was immaculate, no clutter, no warmth. A long hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with abstract art that screamed both money and meaninglessness. A grand piano gleamed in the corner of the living room, untouched, its lid half open as if waiting for an audience that never came. Through the glass doors, a manicured rose garden lay in perfect symmetry, petals so pristine they looked synthetic. Everything in that house seemed curated, as though existence itself were an exhibition of refinement. Charles Bennett rose from an armchair as we entered. He was tall, distinguished, with silver hair combed so precisely it could have been engineered. His handshake was firm but distant, the kind of grip that measured rather than greeted. "Ava," he said, smiling without warmth. "I've heard quite a bit about you." "I hope only good things," I said lightly. He chuckled, the kind of laugh that belonged in boardrooms, not living rooms. "Oh, I like that," he said, turning to his wife. "She's got a sense of humor." Victoria's smile tightened. "Yes, she does." Then came Daniel, descending the staircase with that same hesitant kindness I'd always loved him for. "Hey," he said softly, his expression both apologetic and hopeful. He kissed my cheek quickly, then glanced toward his mother as though seeking silent permission for affection. "You look great." "Thanks," I said, squeezing his hand. His thumb brushed against my wrist, a small reassurance that said, "I know this is uncomfortable. Just breathe." The dining room shimmered under the glow of a chandelier. The table stretched almost absurdly long, set with porcelain plates rimmed in gold and napkins folded into shapes I couldn't name. Everything was perfect. In that way, perfection often is unnerving. "Please," Victoria said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Sit anywhere you like. Well, not anywhere, of course." She laughed, a melodic sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. I sat where she indicated, placing the small paper bag gently beside my chair. "What's this?" she asked, her gaze flicking to it again. "Just some croissants," I said. "From a bakery I love in the city. Thought you might enjoy them for breakfast." "How thoughtful," she murmured, her smile freezing just an inch too long. "I do hope they're not too heavy on butter." "Charles is watching his cholesterol." Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mom, it's fine. She was being kind." "Oh, of course," Victoria said sweetly, reaching for her wine glass. "Kindness is always appreciated." Charles leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "So, Ava," he began. "You're in law, I hear. Corporate work, is it?" "Yes, commercial litigation," I said, keeping my tone even. "Ah, courtroom type." "My respect," he said, though his tone suggested fascination more than admiration. "That must be what's the word, combative?" "Sometimes," I replied. "But mostly, it's just about solving problems before they explode." "Practical," he said approvingly, though I could see the unspoken thought flicker in his eyes. "Useful, but not essential." The conversation drifted through polite territory: weather, the drive, recent travels. Each compliment felt like a blade wrapped in silk. "That's such a brave dress color," Victoria remarked at one point. "Not everyone can pull off something so simple." When I thanked her, she added, "I suppose it's true what they say, confidence can make even the plainest things elegant." I smiled. "I think comfort makes things elegant." Her lips curved, but her eyes didn't. "Of course," she said. For a while, I let the silence stretch. I wanted to observe, to let them speak the way people do when they think they're the hosts of the world. Charles dominated the conversation with stories about networking events and business partners in Hong Kong. Victoria chimed in occasionally to note how exhausting social obligations could be, then subtly name-dropped a senator. Daniel, sweet Daniel, kept glancing at me, as if silently begging me to understand. They mean well. They just don't know any other way to be. But I understood perfectly. I'd seen people like them all my life, the kind who measured others, not by kindness or intellect but by polish, posture, and pedigree. I didn't resent them for it. I just found it predictable. Dinner began like a play whose ending everyone already knew, each actor reciting their lines with practiced civility, their smiles too polished to be real. The chandelier glowed above the table, scattering gold across the wine glasses. The air smelled faintly of rosemary, white truffle, and tension. I sat across from Victoria, to the right of Charles, and diagonally from Daniel, who looked like a man praying for good weather during a storm. For the first few minutes, it was all harmless conversation, business, travel, the renovations on their Napa property. But then, like a shift in the wind, the tone began to cool. "So, Ava," Victoria began, slicing her salmon with surgical precision. "Daniel mentioned you live downtown. The Soma district, was it?" "Yes," I said lightly. "A small studio. Close enough to walk to work if I want." "How urban," she replied, the word dressed like a compliment but wielded like a knife. "I suppose it has its charm. Personally, I prefer somewhere a bit quieter. Atherton can be dull, of course, but at least you don't have to worry about sirens outside your window." I smiled. "I've grown used to the noise. It's oddly comforting." "Really?" she said with a laugh that wasn't a laugh. "You must have a strong constitution. I imagine it takes resilience to live in less polished surroundings." I said nothing. Instead, I sipped my water and met her gaze with calm neutrality. Silence unsettled people like her. Charles interjected, as though reading from a script of paternal interrogation. "So, tell me, Ava, what kind of law do you practice?" "Commercial litigation. Mostly injunctions and corporate disputes." "Ah," he said, nodding. "So you deal with paperwork, contracts, that sort of thing." "That sort of thing," I confirmed. "Fascinating," he said, though it was clear he wasn't fascinated at all. "Daniel tells us you work for a boutique firm. Admirable choice, smaller scale, more heart. Though I imagine the salary doesn't quite compare to the big firms." "I manage," I said simply. Victoria tilted her head, feigning concern. "San Francisco's so expensive these days. You must budget carefully." "Carefully enough," I said. She leaned forward slightly, the pearls at her neck catching the light. "Well, if you ever find yourself in difficulty, dear, don't hesitate to ask. I'd be happy to send something, say, $600 a month to help you with, a wardrobe refresh, perhaps? A woman in your profession should always look put together." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Daniel froze mid-breath, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Mom," he said under his breath, voice tight. I smiled gently. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Bennet, but unnecessary. I'm quite comfortable." "Oh, I insist," she continued sweetly. "You're with Daniel now. Presentation matters when you're part of this family. Atherton is a small world, you see. People talk." "Then I'll make sure they have something worth talking about," I replied softly. Her smile faltered. Just slightly. Then she recovered, turning to her husband. "Isn't she charming, Charles? Such confidence. Reminds me of that woman we met at the Napa Gala, the one who insisted she didn't need a stylist. Do you remember? Charles chuckled. Ah, yes, the one in the linen dress. Ah. Victoria's gaze drifted meaningfully over mine. Exactly. Daniel set down his glass. Mom, please. What? She said innocently. I'm only saying confidence is admirable. Though sometimes, a little polish doesn't hurt. I felt her words land like small, deliberate cuts, meant not to wound but to test. I didn't take the bait. I'd spent too many hours in courtrooms with opposing counsel who tried to provoke emotion. The trick was simple: breathe. Let silence do the work. I like things simple, I said finally. It leaves more room for substance. Charles smiled politely, though I saw the faintest flicker of disapproval in his eyes. Of course, he said. Still, you must understand where Victoria is coming from. In our world, appearance often precedes opportunity. It's not vanity, it's strategy. I understand, I said. In mine, strategy is proving that substance outlasts appearance. The silence that followed was sharp enough to hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Daniel's fingers twitched against the napkin in his lap. Victoria reached for her wineglass, her movement elegant but rigid. Well, she said finally, you certainly have opinions. That's good. Daniel likes women with conviction. Tash. I like women who don't pretend, Daniel said quietly. The air cooled another few degrees. To fill the space, Charles began a story about the Napa Heritage Gala, the social event of the season, where everyone who matters gathered for charity, though it was clear the charity was only half the point. Such a beautiful evening, Victoria said wistfully. The guest list was quite selective this year. They sat us with the Winthrops, you know, the vintners who own half of Sonoma. Lovely people. Their daughter just graduated from Stanford Law, top of her class. That's impressive, I said. Yes, she continued, her eyes gleaming. And so graceful. You could tell she was raised in refinement. It's rare these days. I caught the subtext and smiled faintly. Refinement can mean many things. Some learn it in parlors. Others, in courtrooms. Her knife paused mid-cut, the softest tremor breaking her perfect rhythm. Daniel looked down, fighting a smile. She's good, Mom, he murmured. Victoria's lips curved, though her eyes no longer sparkled. Indeed, she said quietly. Very good. The housekeeper entered to clear the plates, and for a moment, the silence between us felt almost human. But it didn't last. So tell me, Charles said as dessert was served, how long do you see yourself staying at this small firm? Surely someone with your drive must be thinking about scaling up. I met his gaze. I scale impact, not image. He blinked, uncertain whether to be impressed or irritated. That's an interesting philosophy. ONIF. It's served me well so far, I said, taking a sip of tea. And then, like a perfectly timed cue, the universe decided to intervene. My phone, resting on the table beside my water glass, lit up with a soft vibration. A notification banner appeared across the screen before I could turn it face down. Victoria's eyes flicked to it quick, sharp, predatory. Her gaze snagged on the words that glowed briefly before disappearing. Case update, Bennett Ridge Winery v. Northern Valley Distributors. She blinked once. Then again. I saw the flicker of confusion, then recognition. It was the same expression I'd seen in depositions when a witness realized too late what the evidence implied. I calmly reached for the phone and silenced it. Apologies, I said, setting it aside. Court updates never sleep. Victoria's voice was careful now, the sweetness laced with steel. Bennett Ridge Winery, she repeated softly, as if tasting the name. Isn't that interesting? Daniel looked at her, puzzled. Mom? She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on me, studying, calculating. The game had changed and she knew it. I smiled gently, meeting her eyes. Yes, I said. It's an old case. And in that instant, I knew she didn't believe me. Not entirely. Something had cracked in her composure, the smallest fissure in that perfect marble facade. I didn't press it. I didn't need to. Because for the first time all evening, I could see it, the faint shadow of doubt behind her eyes, the one thing she'd never admit aloud. She was beginning to suspect that the woman she'd mistaken for ordinary might be someone far more dangerous. Victoria's voice had cooled into that brittle, careful tone people use when they feel the ground shifting beneath them. Bennett Ridge Winery, she repeated, the name hanging between us like a blade. What a coincidence. Tep. I smiled faintly, resting my palms on the linen tablecloth. Not really, I said softly. You asked earlier about standards. Would you mind if I share mine? The room fell silent. The chandelier light fractured across the wine glasses, scattering slivers of gold on everyone's faces. Daniel froze mid-breath. Charles leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but alert. And Victoria, her spine straightened, pearls catching the light, that perfect mask of civility locked firmly in place. Of course, she said, voice sugar, smooth. We're all ears. Thank you. I reached into my satchel and drew out a single folder, the edges neat, the paper still warm from my printer that afternoon. I placed it gently in front of me, beside the small brown paper bag of croissants. Then, from the same bag, I withdrew my mother's fountain pen, the one engraved with her words. Do right, fear nothing. Its brass body gleamed softly under the chandelier. I believe, I began calmly, that standards aren't about money, reputation, or what part of the city you live in. They're about what you do when people need you. When doing the right thing doesn't benefit you. When no one's watching. I uncapped the pen with a soft click. 3 months ago, Bennett Ridge Winery was days away from bankruptcy. Your distributor had invoked a predatory exclusivity clause that violated the principles of fair dealing. The foreclosure motion was set for Monday, the harvest set for Thursday. If the injunction hadn't been granted in time, your company would have lost its entire crop and your family's business with it. The stillness in the room turned electric. I was the one who wrote that motion. I met Victoria's eyes, calm, unwavering. The trough that kept your irrigation rights intact, delayed your creditors, and forced your distributor to renegotiate. I drafted it, argued it, and won it. Under a different name. I tapped the edge of the folder. That's why this looked familiar to you. Charles blinked once, then leaned forward, squinting at the folder as if trying to read through it without touching it. You, he began, voice low. You worked that case, but the attorney of record was A. Cole. My mother's surname, I said. I worked as external counsel to protect the confidentiality of another client at the time. I signed an NDA, which is why I never mentioned it to Daniel or to anyone. Until tonight. Victoria's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hand trembled faintly around her wine glass, a tremor so small most people would have missed it. I didn't tell you who I was, I continued, not because I wanted to deceive you. I wanted to know if the people your son loved could see worth beyond image. If you could treat someone with dignity even when you thought they had nothing to offer. I slid the folder across the table. Inside, under a redacted cover page, was a single sheet, a certified copy of the order, stamped granted in bold letters beside the judge's signature. Every sensitive name was blacked out, except for one unmistakable caption. Preliminary Injunction Case Number 24395B. Charles reached for it with slow, deliberate hands. The paper crackled faintly as he lifted it. I saw his eyes dart across the text, then freeze when they reached the clause he recognized, the same one that had once threatened his company's collapse. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. This saved the Ridge, he murmured. It saved everything. Yes, I said quietly. 3 days before the harvest. Victoria swallowed hard. Her eyes flicked from the document to me, then to Daniel. She looked suddenly smaller, not physically, but in presence. The air of effortless command had cracked. Why didn't you say anything? She whispered. Because I didn't want Daniel trapped between family loyalty and truth, I said. And because sometimes, respect isn't earned by telling people what you've done, it's earned by watching what they do when they think you're ordinary. Daniel's chair scraped softly against the marble floor. He looked at me, his face a blur of pride, shock, and something deeper remorse. Ava, he began, his voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? My mom, she. It wasn't about your mom, I said gently. It was about me. About whether I could sit here tonight, in this house, and still be seen as enough without a title attached to my name. Victoria's eyes shimmered, though she blinked the emotion away before it could fall. You mean to say, she said slowly, that we owe our family's survival to you? I smiled faintly. No, you owe it to integrity. I was just the one who put it on paper. I do art too. The silence that followed was different this time, no longer hostile, but heavy with reckoning. The air had shifted. I could feel it. For the first time since I stepped into that house, I wasn't the one being examined. They were. Charles set the document down carefully, as if it were fragile. I don't know what to say, he murmured. You don't need to say anything, I said. The work already spoke for me. Ho. Victoria's fingers brushed the edge of the paper, tracing the word granted like a confession she didn't know how to make. I judged you, she said softly. From the moment you walked in. I know, I replied simply. And you still came to dinner. I nodded. Because sometimes, the only way to change a story is to walk into it. Daniel reached for my hand then, his grip warm, grounding. You didn't just save the business, he said quietly. You saved us from becoming the kind of people who can't see beyond themselves. I looked at him, and for the first time that evening, I let my guard drop. Then maybe this dinner wasn't a mistake after all. The room held its breath. Finally, I picked up my mother's pen and placed it gently atop the folder. This belonged to the woman who taught me that respect isn't given, it's chosen. And tonight, I choose to give it to myself. Then I looked at Victoria, not unkindly. Dinner was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. When I stood, the chair legs made a soft sound against the polished floor, a sound so small, yet it cut through the heavy quiet that had filled the room since I'd placed the folder on the table. I gathered my bag, slid the fountain pen carefully into its case, and turned to them one last time. Thank you for dinner, I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle. It was enlightening. No one moved. Victoria's hands still rested on the document, as if it might disappear if she let go. Charles sat very still, his eyes unfocused, as though replaying the conversation in his mind. Daniel looked up at me, the kind of look that said everything words couldn't: pride, apology, guilt. I gave him a small nod. Good night, Daniel. When I reached the front door, Victoria finally found her voice. Ava, wait. It wasn't sharp this time. It was quiet, fragile, like porcelain. I turned slightly. She looked as though she wanted to say more but couldn't decide how to begin. Her lips parted, then closed again. In the end, she just whispered, "Thank you." I gave her a small smile. "You're welcome," I said. Truly. Then I opened the door and stepped into the cold. Outside, the air was different. Real. The warmth and perfume of the house gave way to the chill of an Atherton night, dry eucalyptus and distant sea salt carried on the wind. I walked down the long driveway, past trimmed hedges that cast perfect shadows under the amber lights. Behind me, the house glowed like a porcelain dollhouse, beautiful, sealed, and hollow. At the gate, I paused and looked back one last time. Through the wide windows, I could see the reflection of the chandelier shimmering across the dining table. 3 figures sat motionless in the light, a family that measured worth in pedigree, power, and presentation. For years, I'd lived around people like them, people who thought silence equaled grace, that manners could substitute for morality. Tonight, for the first time, I had broken their silence and walked away intact. The wind picked up as I stepped onto El Camino Real. The road stretched wide and quiet, the yellow streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle. I walked without hurrying, my shoes clicking softly, the brown paper bag of croissants still tucked under my arm crumbled slightly now, imperfect, human. As I moved farther from the Bennett's gates, I let my thoughts unfurl. Silence can be a prison, I thought. It's easy to confuse it with peace, especially for women like me, trained to stay composed, to be agreeable, to not make the room uncomfortable. But silence doesn't protect you. It just builds walls that keep you from hearing your own voice. I thought of all the times I'd let people talk over me in meetings, assuming I'd wait my turn. All the times I'd bitten my tongue in court, at dinner tables, in relationships. I had mistaken silence for dignity. Tonight, I understood the difference. Dignity isn't about staying quiet when you're disrespected. It's about knowing when to speak and trusting that your truth doesn't need anyone's permission. The street was nearly empty now, save for the rhythmic sweep of headlights gliding past every few minutes. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint hum of the Caltrain heading towards San Francisco. I stopped for a moment, the night pressing cool against my skin, and tilted my head up toward the dark sky. The moon was half hidden behind eucalyptus branches, its light trembling between the leaves. I thought of Spokane, of my mother grating papers at the kitchen table, her ink-stained fingers wrapped around a chipped mug. "Respect isn't something you buy, Ava," she'd said once. "It's something you carry inside you, and if you guard it well, no one can take it away." I smiled faintly at the memory. That lesson had followed me from that small wooden house to every courtroom, every client meeting, every quiet moment of doubt. It was the same truth I'd seen written across the faces of the people I defended, the workers, the small business owners, the ones who built things others took for granted. They didn't wear wealth, but they carried worth. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the tall eucalyptus leaves. The sound reminded me of the courthouse steps at dawn, cold, crisp, full of possibility. I drew my coat tighter and kept walking. When I reached the corner, I passed a cafe that was closing for the night. Inside, a barista wiped down the counter while soft jazz played from an old speaker. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass, hair slightly undone, eyes tired but steady. For the first time in a long time, I liked what I saw. Not because I had proven something, but because I no longer needed to. Freedom, I realized, isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause or validation. It comes quietly, in moments like this, when you stop twisting yourself to fit someone else's mold, when you stop needing the approval of people who never intended to understand you. A car passed, splashing through a shallow puddle, its taillights glowing red against the night. I watched it fade into the distance. In the silence that followed, I felt something unclench inside me, like an invisible chain had finally been undone. "I don't need them to see me," I whispered to the empty street. "I see myself." The words hung in the air for a moment, carried away by the wind. At the bus stop near the corner, a small billboard caught my eye, an ad for a law scholarship fund for underrepresented students. I stopped and read the tagline twice, "Build the world you wish existed." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The court update was still on the screen. Case update, Bennett Ridge Winery. Order granted. I smiled to myself, then opened a new note. A few lines, an idea, something that had been forming in the back of my mind all evening. Her Worth Project. Legal literacy workshops for small business owners. Teach them to read what they sign before the world writes over them. I saved the note, locked my phone, and tucked it away. The thought made me feel light, almost giddy. The night no longer felt cold. A gentle breeze swept through the street, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and wet asphalt. As I walked toward the station lights in the distance, I thought of Daniel, not with anger, but with a strange compassion. Maybe he would need time to untangle himself from the world he was raised in. Maybe he would call. Or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I was free. Behind me, the Bennett mansion stood invisible beyond the trees, still bright and silent. Ahead of me, The city stretched out imperfect, alive, and entirely mine. That night, under the dim yellow glow of El Camino Real, I understood something I'd been chasing for years. Freedom doesn't begin when others accept you. It begins the moment you stop asking them to. The next morning, the city was washed in pale sunlight, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it is. I woke to the quiet hum of the street below, the scent of coffee drifting from the cafe downstairs. For a moment, I almost believed the night before had been a dream, the chandelier light, the papers on the table, the silence after truth landed like a stone in a glass pond. But when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the name on the screen pulled me back to reality. Daniel. I stared at it for a second before answering. His voice came through low, cracked around the edges. Ava, I didn't sleep, he said quietly. I just needed to tell you I'm sorry. For sitting there, saying nothing, when I should have said everything. I didn't reply right away. The sound of his voice, raw, unguarded, felt both familiar and new. He continued. After you left, there was silence. Mom didn't move for a long time. Then Dad asked what happened, and she just said, she's the one. He didn't understand. He thought she meant something else. But then she looked at me and asked, do you love her that much? I said yes. And she just started to cry. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. She cried? He let out a shaky breath. Yeah. My mom, the woman who treats feelings like weakness, she cried. She said she spent her whole life teaching me to be admirable, but not necessarily good. Then she asked my dad, when did we start believing kindness needed a pedigree? For a moment, I said nothing. It was too much, too tender. He went on. Dad was quiet. Then he said something I'll never forget. We forgot the basic lesson. Respect shouldn't have prerequisites. He told me you reminded him of that. He said we'd both become blind in comfort. The words settled in me like the slow warmth of morning light. I turned toward the window. The fog was lifting from the bay, sunlight glinting faintly across rooftops. That's a start, I said softly. But Daniel, this isn't about them. It's about you. I know, he said. That's why I need to see you. Please, just talk. After a moment of hesitation, I said, Crissy Field. In an hour. The bay wind was brisk when I got there, that familiar tang of salt and iron, the kind that wakes you from the inside out. The Golden Gate loomed in the distance, half shrouded in fog, like a bridge between two worlds that never quite touched. I stood by the path, my hair whipping around my face, and watched a group of runners go by. When Daniel arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept, eyes red, coat unbuttoned, hands buried deep in his pockets. He slowed when he saw me, as if unsure whether he had the right to come closer. Hey, he said quietly. Hey, I replied. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the waves filled the silence, steady and unbothered. A dog barked somewhere behind us, then the world went still again. Finally, Daniel said, I replayed last night 100 times in my head. Every time, I kept seeing you calm, steady, holding your ground while the rest of us shrank. You weren't just defending yourself. You were showing us what real grace looks like. I turned to him, my voice quiet but firm. Grace isn't silence, Daniel. It's the ability to stay kind without making yourself small. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. You're right, and I've been small my whole life. Trying to fit the mold my parents built, polite, successful, safe. I thought that was love, to make them proud. But last night, I realized I was just scared to disappoint them, scared to lose you, scared to be seen as less. Fear keeps people obedient, I said softly. But love doesn't ask you to shrink. Peace doesn't mean everyone's comfortable, it means you can breathe without apology. He looked at me then, really looked, and there was no defense left in his eyes, just quiet understanding. I see you now, he said. Not the version I imagined. You. The woman who fights battles no one sees and still chooses kindness. The woman who could have humiliated us but didn't. I felt my throat tighten. You didn't need to say that, I whispered. I did, he said. Because last night, you showed me who you are. And this morning, I need to show you who I want to be. The wind swept between us, tugging at the hem of my coat. I turned toward the bridge, its red arcs barely visible through the mist. Do you really think people can change? I asked. He stepped closer, his voice steady now. Not for someone else, but maybe because of them. For a moment, we just stood there, facing the water. A seagull dipped low over the bay, its reflection fractured across the waves. The sun broke through the fog, streaking the bridge in faint gold. Then Daniel reached for my hand, not hesitantly this time, but with quiet certainty. His palm was warm against mine, his fingers trembling just a little. I can't promise I'll be perfect, he said. But I can promise I'll be honest. With you, with them, with myself. I squeezed his hand gently. That's all I've ever wanted. Honesty, not performance. Not, he nodded, his eyes softening. Then no more pretending. I smiled, the kind of smile that comes after a long exhale. No more pretending. We stood there for a while, watching the fog drift back toward the ocean. The world felt open again, uncertain, but wide enough for truth to exist. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic kiss, just the sound of the waves and the quiet rhythm of two people choosing to begin again, honestly. And as the bridge emerged fully from the mist, its red steel gleaming under the new sun, I realized that some relationships aren't about building a perfect life together, they're about rebuilding yourself beside someone who finally sees you. 2 weeks later, on a gray San Francisco morning that smelled faintly of ocean salt and roasted coffee, someone knocked on my studio door. I had just finished outlining the curriculum for my first community legal workshop, notes scattered across the kitchen table, laptop open, the smell of printer ink in the air. When I opened the door, I froze. There she was. Victoria Bennett, standing in the hallway, holding a wicker basket filled with fruit and fresh flowers. She looked different. Not in the way expensive people sometimes dress down to appear humble, but in a way that felt quietly human. Her hair was pinned loosely, her usual pearls replaced by a simple gold chain. The power suit was gone. Instead, she wore a soft cream sweater and jeans. "Good morning, Ava," she said, her voice careful but genuine. "I hope I'm not intruding." I blinked, then stepped aside. "Not at all. Come in." "Well." She entered slowly, eyes sweeping across the small space, the stacked law books, the bicycle leaning against the wall, the framed photo of my parents in Spokane. There was no judgment this time. Only quiet observation. She set the basket on the counter. I wasn't sure what people bring when they owe someone an apology. Fruit felt safe. "No." I smiled. "Fruit is perfect." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was different now, softer, the kind that waits instead of weighs. Finally, she turned toward me. "I've spent most of my life mistaking politeness for kindness," she said quietly. "And performance for integrity. You reminded me that the two aren't the same." I studied her face, the faint tremor around her mouth, the exhaustion that comes after pretending for too long. "It's not easy to unlearn," I said. "No," she agreed. "But it's harder to live with the consequences of not unlearning." Then she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I heard about your project," she said. Her worth in law. "The workshops. I think it's extraordinary." "You heard from Daniel?" "Yes," she said. "He told me what you're building, teaching women to understand contracts, to protect their small businesses, to not sign away power disguised as opportunity." She hesitated. "I want to help," quietly. I frowned slightly. "Help how?" She handed me the envelope. Inside was a check, generous but unsigned. "An anonymous donation," she said. "For your first year's operations. No strings, no press, just support." I looked up, surprised. "Why anonymous?" Her lips curved into a small, rueful smile. "Because I've spent my life wanting my name on things. It's time I learned the value of leaving it off." For a long moment, I just stood there, holding the check between us. "You don't owe me this," I said softly. "I know," she replied. "I owe it to myself." When she turned to leave, she paused by the door. "For what it's worth," she said, glancing back, "Daniel is right about you. You didn't just save a company, you reminded us that decency isn't negotiable." After she left, I stood in the quiet, the faint scent of gardenias lingering in the air. It felt like closure, not the kind that ends a story, but the kind that turns it into something new. A month later, her worth-in-law held its first session at a small community center near Mission Bay. The folding chairs squeaked on the linoleum floor as women filed in hair tied up, notebooks in hand, some nervous, some curious. 15 faces, all carrying stories of being dismissed, underpaid, or overlooked. Daniel was there early, rolling up his sleeves to arrange the chairs, setting out a tray of coffee and pastries. He didn't speak much, just smiled and worked. When I glanced over, he gave me a small nod, that quiet kind of encouragement that doesn't need words. Victoria arrived last, wearing a plain volunteer badge that simply read, V. Bennett. She carried a crate of water bottles and a stack of handouts, moving quietly, greeting everyone with a smile that for once didn't feel practiced. No cameras, no reporters, no attention. Just presence. When it was time to begin, I stood at the front of the room, my mother's fountain pen clipped to my folder. The women's eyes were on me, a mix of expectation and trust that made my chest tighten. "Before we start," I said, "I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me early in my career. If you let others define your worth, you'll have to change your value every time they change the rules. Don't negotiate your identity to fit a system that wasn't built for you. Learn the language of power, then use it to rewrite the terms." For a moment, the room was silent. Then heads began to nod. Pens moved. And I realized this, not the courtroom, was where the real battles were won. As the workshop went on, laughter broke out, questions filled the air, and something in me felt whole again. I caught sight of Daniel near the back, pouring coffee for a woman who'd come straight from her shift at a bakery. He looked up and smiled, a quiet, unspoken pride between us. A few seats away, Victoria handed out notebooks, her eyes focused, her gestures sincere. No spotlight, no announcement, just work. By the end of the session, the whiteboard was covered in notes. Read every clause. No waiver without consent. Fairness is not a favor. When the last attendee left, a young woman lingered behind. She looked about 25, nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said shyly. "I was about to sign a contract for my salon that would have taken half my profits. Because of this, I didn't. You didn't just save my shop, you saved my faith that people like us can learn to fight back." I felt my throat tighten again. "You saved yourself," I told her. "We just gave you the tools." She smiled and left, the door closing softly behind her. Later, as we cleaned up, Victoria gathered the empty cups and paused beside me. "You know," she said quietly, "kindness doesn't come naturally to people who've spent their lives performing. But it can be practiced. You're teaching me that." I smiled. "We're all learning something." When everyone had gone, I stepped outside. The afternoon light shimmered over the bay, the wind cool and sharp. I swung a leg over my bike, the fountain pen tucked safely in my bag. As I pedaled along the waterfront path, I felt light, the kind of lightness that only comes from alignment, from finally living in your own truth. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my jacket. I stopped near the railing, pulled it out, and read the message. Subject: "Thank you." It was from the young salon owner. "You didn't just save my business," she wrote. "You reminded me that my voice matters. You saved my belief in fairness." I looked up at the sky, the bridge glowing faintly gold in the distance. The wind brushed against my face, and I could almost hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind. "Do right, fear nothing." I smiled and started pedaling again, the city sprawling before me, imperfect, alive, full of stories still untold. And to everyone watching this story now, I'd say this. If it touched something in you, tell me what makes you rich in spirit. Because maybe that's where all true wealth begins.